It's time for another episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show, a podcast where I connect you with thought leaders from across the globe, digging into some of my favorite topics like personal development, marketing, spirituality, and pretty much any other shiny object that happens to catch my attention. Today, my special guest is Matt Seeger, and we're going to be discussing his book, The God Squad, The Born Again San Francisco Giants of 1978. Matt, it is truly an honor, sir. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Sean.
I think the place I'd love to start, Matt, is here a bit of the Matt Seeger origin story, superpowers, special abilities. What do the people need to know about you?
Sure. Thanks, Sean. Well, I grew up in northern New Jersey. Both my parents were Jewish, so I was raised culturally Jewish, not very religiously Jewish at all. I went to Cornell University for my undergrad, got interested in journalism by writing for the Cornell Daily Sun, and then got a master's degree in journalism from Syracuse University's Newhouse School. And my first job out of school was writing sports, mostly high school sports, for the Cortland Standard in Cortland, New York. And everything was going along swimmingly in that sense. But personally, in my life, I was going through crises, and I won't go into detail. But in 1978, coincidentally, which the year my book is about, I gave my life to Jesus and became a Jewish believer in Jesus. Since that time, I've had some jobs in journalism, sometimes out of journalism. But one thing I always did was freelance articles about Christian athletes, sharing their testimonies. And so that's why the book I wrote is in keeping with that. But this is the first full-length book I've ever written.
And in terms of the story behind the book, like why go down the rabbit hole of turning this into a full length book? How did this story get on your radar? Like what made you sit down and put fingers to keyboard, so to speak?
Sure. Well, around 1980, I moved to San Francisco to work with the Jews for Jesus organization, which is headquartered out here. And during that time, I got familiar with the San Francisco Chronicle sports columnists. And two of them in particular, Lowell Cohn and Glenn Dickey, were taking pot shots at these born again giants, which they were calling the God Squad at that point. And it kind of irked me as a believer, the kind of articles that were being written. Well, right at this time, providentially, I was introduced to Gary Lavelle, who was a key leader of the so-called God Squad. And I interviewed him and wrote his testimony up for the Fellowship of Christian Athletes magazine. And then I met with Gary in his home, and we talked about these articles that were being written, some of them targeted right at him. And I said, Gary, I think this would be a really good book. And he agreed, but we soon realized neither of us had the time to devote to a book, given our busy lives and raising kids and all this. So I forgot about the whole thing. But when I retired, my last job was as a sports reporter here in California for the Vacaville newspaper. And but when I retired a few years ago, one day I was driving down to the Martinez Public Library. I live in Martinez, California. And I thought I'd like to write a book, but what could I write about? And I thought about the God Squad. So I wondered, is Gary Lavelle still around? Are any of these guys still around? Well, lo and behold, they were. And so I interviewed a couple of those guys. I interviewed Lowell Cohn, the guy who wrote some of those satirical columns. I interviewed Henry Schulman, who covered the Giants. Anyway, all of that I was able to put together along with newspaper archives into a book. And that's how it happened.
I'd love to hear what it was like to interview Lowell and Henry. You're a Jewish believer in Jesus. They are both Jewish, but not believers. Did the faith aspect of this book ever come up in that conversation? Tell us what that was like.
Yeah, well, it did, especially with Lowell. And it was fascinating to me, Sean, because I had some fear and trepidation approaching Lowell Cohn because he's a very acerbic, cynical, satirical writer, and he comes off as rather brash and probably unfriendly, in his columns. And I didn't know, A, would he want to talk to me at all after all these years? And B, if I told him I'm a Jewish believer in Jesus, would that just kill the whole thing? Well, I got his email address, emailed him. I was so surprised how gracious he was. I was upfront about who I was and what I believed. And he was so gracious. He said he'd be glad to help me. And one day he called me and we talked for like 40 minutes on the phone. And I found there was no animus on his part, really, certainly not toward me or even to Christians in general. He was an equal opportunity satirist and he wrote like 8,000 columns and he pretty much, satirized anybody. So, similarly, Henry Schulman, I gave full disclosure to Henry, who was the beat writer for the Giants, and he was very forthcoming, telling me some really funny stories. And so both of these guys, and I commend them in the acknowledgement section for their professionalism and their willingness to talk to me after all those years. Yeah, and it did, with Lowell, it did come up about his Jewishness, and there's a whole chapter I wrote called "Understanding Lowell Cohn," and he was very open about his Jewish religious background and how it impacts his writing, and I found him really interesting guy to talk to.
And you had mentioned that 1978 was a significant year for you. You said that was when you became a believer in Jesus. For me, that was a significant year because it's when I was born. But in terms of this story and the God Squad, what was special about 1978?
Okay, a little background here for our listeners. So, um, in the late 60s and early 70s, something called the Jesus Revolution started in Southern California. They even made a movie people may have seen called the very good movie, Jesus Revolution. And that kind of wound its way up the coast to Northern California. And in around 1976, Gary Lavelle of the Giants went to play winter ball, and a guy named Tom Griffin, a pitcher for the Minnesota Twins, shared his faith with Gary. So Gary came back to the Giants in 77 and quietly began to share his faith with his teammates. And a few of them got saved through Gary or through other means. And by 1978, I'd estimate there were 10 or probably 11 born again Giants on the team. And the other thing, it was a real confluence of events because the Giants had been terrible throughout the 70s. 71, they won the division. After that, they only had one winning season until 1978, when all of a sudden they were playing great baseball. And then you had these Giants, the born again Giants, after the game, giving praise to God, not necessarily for winning, but for the abilities he gave them and for the peace they had in doing their thing. And the press didn't raise any objection because the Giants were winning. And the Giants were in first place through much of the season until mid-August when the Dodgers overtook them and eventually the Reds overtook them. Giants finished in third, but for the fan base, it was huge because they were used to losing and now the Giants were winning. So the reporters didn't really have anything negative to say about the God Squatters because they're winning. Everything's going great. But in 1979, they got off to a horrendous start. And the journalists, looking for something to make a story, decided that it was the born again Christians' fault because they were too passive. And if they lost, they said, "Oh, it's just God's will." And so that's when the tables turned and the negative press started. And but it all started in 78. That's when you had 10 or 11 of these giants talking about Jesus.
And in terms of the story, was this just a story local to San Francisco, or did it have more of an effect in the States? Did it reach anything international? How wide was this story?
It had repercussions nationally. And the other thing people need to understand about 1978, or the late 70s in San Francisco is San Francisco had become a haven for, well, the whole hippie movement. Kids moved out, young people moved out here because they wanted freedom. And in many cases, for the gay population, they wanted that kind of freedom where they wouldn't be judged. But there was also an atmosphere where people were in favor of legalizing drugs. Uh, they were in favor of abortion. They're politically very left. So for the God Squad to materialize in that environment created quite a story because uh, here you had these Christians, and I think the fear among the culture in the Bay Area was: are these people judging us? Are they holier than thou? And it wasn't the case at all. But there was that conflict, and so when the press began to write about this, uh, and I'll get into this, I hope, a little later, but there were all sorts of stories blaming the born agains for all sorts of problems with the team, including getting two managers fired. And there was no truth to that. One of the most hilarious stories was that somebody wrote that there were two buses to take them to the game, uh, uh, and one was for the born agains, and one was for the other guys. And that was just a made up story. It wasn't true. So what happened nationally is people like Peter Gammons of the Boston Globe and Dick Young of the New York Daily News heard these stories and repeated them as if they were fact in their columns. And so the God Squad became sort of nationally notorious, whereas if you had a group of Christians, say, playing for the Houston Astros somewhere in the Bible Belt, this never would have become a thing.
And I understand there was also a second wave of the God Squad, which you called God Squad 2. Tell us about that.
Yeah, well, what happened, Shaun, was by 1984, the Giants had traded away every single one of those born again players. Now, some people accuse the Giants of doing that intentionally, and I don't know that that's true. I don't know that anybody could prove that. But the funny thing was that at the same time they were getting rid of the God Squad, there was a new cadre of born again Christians coming up to the team through the farm system and other means. So by the late 1980s, you had what I call God Squad 2, and you had people like uh, late 80s, early 90s, you had Dave Dravecki, the pitcher, Gary Carter, the Hall of Fame catcher, Brett Butler, great center fielder, Atlee Hammaker, great left-handed pitcher. You had all these guys who were, again, vocal about their faith. But the thing that I found interesting is the press was much more accepting by then. Um, I think that they had gotten over the initial shock and realized, and I think players in baseball in general were getting a little more vocal, and that may be attributable to the courage of the God Squatters who kind of broke that barrier by talking about their faith. So you find with God Squad 2 that most of the press about them was positive. Dave Dravecki, in particular, had a remarkable story. He got cancer in his throwing arm, his left arm, and uh, was recovering from that. And actually, after a year of recovery, came back to Candlestick Park and pitched a 4-3 victory over the Cincinnati Reds. And everybody in San Francisco was just thrilled. It was a huge, huge event for Dravecki's comeback. But coupled, I think his next start up in Montreal, while he was pitching, everybody heard a loud crack, and the bone in his left arm had broken because the cancer treatment had weakened it. And then eventually the cancer returned and his arm and shoulder were amputated. Uh, but Dravecki was a very strong Christian and used all those events as a platform to declare his faith. So that was God Squad 2.
And do you everything? And I don't know, this would be with the Giants or just more broadly. Will we ever see? Do you ever think we'll see a God Squad 3 somewhere in baseball?
I don't, Sean. And the reason is a few reasons. I think, as I said, as more and more players became vocal about their faith, the media became more accepting, if not thrilled, but accepting that, hey, this is just a normal thing. And if you look around sports today, it's so common. You can watch any sporting event, watch the NFL playoffs when they interview Jaden Daniels, the quarterback of the Commanders. He spoke up immediately about his faith. Brock Purdy on the 49ers is very open about his faith. Of course, Tim Tebow was, and I think it's just become commonplace now. And so there won't be, even if the Giants were to get a big number of born again Christians again, they have a few, but it really wouldn't create any waves because, as I say, I think the God Squad were kind of pioneers in that way. And if we have a few moments, I'd like to tell you some of the incidents that happened with the
Yeah,
God
please.
Squad. Yeah. One of the most notorious was the Giants had a pitcher named Bob Nepper, really good left-handed pitcher. And Nepper got saved through Gary Lavelle's testimony and through um, just God. Nepper said that one night in his hotel room, he just fell down on his knees and realized he was a sinner. And he said he had 30 minutes experience with the Holy Spirit just touching him. He was weeping uncontrollably, for that time. And he got saved. That was in, early baseball season 78, April or May. Well, he went on to have a fantastic year as a pitcher. And uh, so Nepper was a key God Squad member. But what happened after the 79 season, during the winter meetings, baseball winter meetings when executives meet and, talk about trades, some people were posting, there was this newsletter and they would post little items about Major League Baseball players. And one item that they pinned on the bulletin board said that when Nepper gave up a game-winning home run and the manager came out to talk to him about it, Nepper said, "Well, it was God's will." It was God's will I gave up the home run. And that story spread like wildfire. And none of it was true. And I spent a whole chapter on that, debunking that theory. But that accusation followed Nepper around to the point where even when he was traded to the Houston Astros, uh, it kept coming up. He told a funny story where he was the player rep uh, uh, for the Giants, or maybe it was the Astros. In any case, he went to the player rep meetings, and Scott McGregor of the Baltimore Orioles, who he had never met before, came up to him and said, "Oh, Bob, you're the guy who said it was God's will, right?" And Nepper's like, "Wow, this story followed me to the American League," and he was hounded by the press about that false story. And one of the things I stress in the book as a journalist is how dangerous and wrong it is for journalists to spread a story that they haven't researched themselves back to the original source, because that is what happened with that story, with God's will, with the other stories about the team bus, with accusations that the Giants God Squad got the managers fired. All those things were repeated and spread. I found articles in the archives. I found one in Ottawa, Canada, that talked about how the God Squatters were this disruptive force on the team. So yeah, a lot of what I talk about is you talk about fake news. Well, this was an example where a story that wasn't researched was repeated, and to the detriment of the Giants. And I can go on and tell you one of the most inflammatory things that happened uh, uh, with the Giants was Lowell Cohn wrote a piece called "Can Satan Save the Giants?" And his premise was, and it was all a joke for him, but not so much for the God Squatters. He said, "Look, in 1979, the team's losing pretty badly, and God doesn't seem to be helping them too much. So why don't one of you sell his soul to the devil and see how that works out?" And it was a play. I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Damn Yankees, but yeah, the Washington Senators fan Joe Hardy is so fed up with the Yankees winning all the time that the devil comes to him and he sells his soul to the devil and becomes this great baseball player for the Washington Senators. So that was the idea. It was tongue in cheek. But what happened is there were a year later, he wrote another article called Lavelle and the Fiend, Fiend. And this one created more waves because Lavelle had given an interview to George Vexey of the New York Times about the God Squad. And Vexey asked some pointed questions, and Lavelle just responded uh, according to the questions. And he talked. Vexey asked about homosexuality and how he felt about that, in the Bay Area. And Lavelle said, "Well, I have homosexuals who are friends of mine, but if they ask me, about it, I have to tell them that God's word says it's a sin, things like that." And that he said the Bay Area is a very satanic area, and he said that because there's a Church of Satan that was founded by Anton LaVey in San Francisco. So, so everything Lavelle said was accurate, but of course, the way Vexey reported it, it made Lavelle sound like he was anti-gay, gay basher. And so when Lowell Cohn wrote this column, Lavelle and the Fiend, he quoted from Vexey's article, and it really got some bad reaction in the Bay Area. And Lavelle began to get death threats, letters and death threats as a result of the article. So, follow up to that, Cohn wrote a column called Friendly Persuasion, where he went into the clubhouse and talked to Johnny LeMaster, one of the God Squad, and Johnny said, what you wrote really hurt Gary. He was getting death threats and everything. So Cohn went over to Lavelle and asked him about it. He said, "Well, did you say those things?" And Lavelle said, "Yeah, but it sounded different when you didn't hear the questions, you know." And they had a good conversation. And Cohn completed the column by saying, "I wish that LeMaster and Lavelle had yelled at me or something, but they just seemed to turn the other cheek and they were very nice." And he said, "That's the worst thing they could have done because I didn't know what to do with that." So, so it was a good witness, but that's the kind of intense interaction that happened between the press and the God Squad at that time.
And it's intriguing to hear, this level of drama coming out of print journalism from back in the day. Now this is all
Oh yeah,
online, and stories live for a moment, and then they move on to the next sensational thing. I feel like people in the generations after mine have lost the context for really this impact and prominence of print media
for sure.
back in the day. In terms of the reader's journey with the book, somebody spends their time and they read through the God Squad. Like, what's the takeaway? What's that thread you hope every single person grasps from this story?
Well, I hope, Shaun, that people see that it took a lot of courage for these guys to talk about Jesus in that environment, and they were not shy about doing it. And it wasn't just Lavelle and Nepper; it was Jack Clark and Rob Andrews, um, Mike Ivey, and all of these guys. As you read through the book, you see them uh, openly declaring their faith. In a very fresh way, because most of these guys had just come to the Lord, and they were in that kind of honeymoon phase, and they were going to talk about it. And I hope that readers will see that, yeah, often going to be blowback when we speak up for our faith. Hopefully it won't be as intense as what these guys experience, but it is going to go against the grain. And I hope that, that we, myself included, will, when the opportunity arises, not be shy to thank God for and tell people. And I don't think that we're going to pay the kind of price that these guys did necessarily, but uh, if they could do it in that situation, then it's something we ought to be able to do without shame. I am not ashamed of the gospel, the power of salvation for Jew like me and Gentile alike.
Yeah, and I think really this illustrates that standing up for truth, proclaiming truth, often comes at a cost. It depends on the circumstances, like where you are sharing truth. Depending on the audience that you are speaking to or who's receiving your message, they're going to react differently. But when you're a prominent influencer, as these guys were as professional athletes in culture, it definitely was a risk to step out and share their faith. And I'm assuming back in the day, like it sounds like it was way less common for athletes to be sharing their faith. Like it seems normalized today, but was it really quite risky back in the day for these players?
Oh, good point, Shaun, because I overlooked that. Yes, especially in baseball. So, what happened in baseball in the 50s and 60s, the only thing that was happening in that regard, well, the New York Yankees had a couple of guys, Bobby Richardson, who went on to be the president of Baseball Chapel. Uh, Bobby Richardson formed a small Bible study group, and they met like in a hotel on a Sunday morning before the game. Eventually, I think they moved that to a room outside of the clubhouse in the stadium, but it was a very small gathering. The Minnesota Twins had a similar gathering, but all of this was just kind of nurturing the Christians, which is a good thing. And today we have Baseball Chapel, which is in all the parks on Sunday where players can meet and have a small devotional and pray together. But publicly, it was extremely rare for a baseball player to, in an interview, start talking about God. Just was not happening in the 50s and 60s. And so that was the other thing. When the God Squad began to do that, that was a new thing. Nobody had really been doing that, certainly not to the extent that they did. And so, yeah, it was, they were pioneers that way.
And for you, Matt, in terms of the writing journey, what was it like for you to kind of transition from, like you said, you're used to more writing articles and such? What was it like to move into doing a full length book? Did it anything that surprised you with a longer piece like this?
What surprised me was how quickly it came together, Shaun. And what happened was my daughter was living in Southern California at that time, and she had back surgery. My wife and I went down to just support her. And being retired during the day when she was in the hospital, I was just on her couch in her apartment, began writing this book. And all the chapters, like the organization came into my mind, and I just started writing. I had all day on her couch just writing, and I wrote the whole book in 2 months. It just, you know, God just gave me the outline for it. And then between the interviews I had done and the archives, which were voluminous, to my amazement about the God Squad, I was able to piece it together. So, um, and then fortunate enough to find both a copy editor in my church and a publisher in my church. And so the publishing end, but the getting the thing published is harder than writing it usually. But I was very fortunate in that regard.
Well, as a guy who spent 11 years in Christian publishing, I can verify the writing is sometimes easier than finding a home for a new book, depending on
Yeah.
what you're writing and the size platform and audience that you're bringing to the table. Matt, in terms of people getting their own copy of the book, where can they go out and pick up their own copy of the God Squad?
Sure. They can find it on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Thrift Books, or Target. If you look for it on Amazon, for example, be aware there are two versions of the book. One has all 13 photos supplied by the Giants in full color, and that one costs a little more, but there's a less expensive version with the same photos in black and white. So when you go on Amazon site, look for where it says all versions, and you can find that. And some of the other sites may have that distinction as well. But yeah, it's out there. I mean, just type in my name, Matt Seeger, God Squad, in Google, and all of this stuff will come up.
So basically available wherever great books are sold. We'll make it easy like we do with every episode. We'll have links in the description and the show notes to places where you can pick up your very own copy of Matt's book. It's time to bring this episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show to a close. Many thanks for being a part of my conversation with Matt Seeger. Once again, our book today was The God Squad, the born-again San Francisco Giants of 1978. And Matt, I want to say thank you so much for sharing with us today. It's been an honor and a pleasure to have you on the show.